In the quiet town of Maplewood, the police department was like any other, strict, structured, and ruled by tradition. But change had come, and it came in the form of Police Chief Angela Monroe. She wasn't just a leader, she was a force of nature. Strong, determined, and with a reputation for fairness, Angela had worked her way up from patrol officer to chief, earning the respect of most, though not all. Her promotion didn't sit well with everyone, and not because of her qualifications. For some, her being a black woman in charge of the force was a problem they weren't ready to accept. One of those people was Officer Rick Harlan, a veteran cop with 15 years on the force and an ego bruised by Angela's rise. He'd been passed over for promotions more times than he cared to admit, and the bitterness in his heart festered. To him, Angela represented everything wrong with what he called politics over experience. He watched her every move, waiting for a moment to prove she wasn't fit to lead, to show everyone that she didn't belong. It started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the call came in about a disturbance at a local diner. Angela and Rick both arrived on the scene. The air was heavy with tension, not just from the storm but from the friction between the two officers. Angela was calm and professional, as always. Rick, however, was wound tight, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Inside the diner, Angela handled the situation with ease, diffusing what could have been a volatile confrontation. Rick stood to the side, arms crossed, barely concealing his disdain. As the situation wrapped up, Rick muttered under his breath, "Guess you got lucky this time." Angela turned, her eyes meeting his. "Luck had nothing to do with it," she said evenly. "That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't." Later that day, back at the station, Rick's simmering anger boiled over. He cornered Angela in the hallway, his voice low but sharp. "You think you can come in here and tell me how to do my job?" he sneered. Angela didn't flinch. "I expect everyone to do their job, Rick. Including you." His face turned red, veins bulging in his neck. "You don't belong here," he spat. "You never did." What happened next shocked everyone. Rick, blinded by his rage, stepped forward and shoved Angela hard. She stumbled but didn't fall. The station fell silent as officers turned to see what was happening. Angela straightened, her eyes locked on Rick. The room held its breath. Rick smirked, thinking he'd won, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. Angela took a step closer, her voice low and steady. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." And in that moment, everything changed. Rick's smirk faltered when Angela didn't back down. The confidence he'd worn like armor slipped as he realized he wasn't dealing with the person he thought she was. Angela wasn't just his boss on paper, she was someone who had earned every ounce of her authority, and it showed in the way she held her ground, calm but firm, unshaken by his outburst. The station felt frozen in time. Conversations had stopped, the hum of the copier in the corner was the only sound, and every officer nearby was watching, wide-eyed, unsure of what to do next. Some of them were Rick's friends, and he expected them to step in, to back him up, but no one moved. Even they knew he'd crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Angela took a slow, deliberate breath, as if she was weighing every word carefully. "Rick," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think you can intimidate me?" She leaned in just enough that only he could hear the next part. "I've faced worse than you in this job, in this life. Do you think a shove is going to make me walk away?" Rick's face was a mixture of anger and something else, maybe fear, maybe regret, but he didn't respond. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then snapped it shut again. Angela stared at him a second longer, then straightened, turning to the others who had gathered. "Back to work," she said calmly. Her tone wasn't raised, but it carried authority, and like that, the spell was broken. Officers glanced at each other, then slowly dispersed, the murmurs beginning only when they were out of earshot. But the buzz of what had just happened lingered. Angela walked away, her footsteps steady, but inside, the anger was bubbling. Not because of Rick's childish display, but because it wasn't the first time she'd faced this. The subtle jabs, the snide comments, the questioning of her abilities, she'd been dealing with it for years. Every woman in law enforcement knew this feeling, but it didn't make it easier. She was tired of playing by their rules, tired of pretending she wasn't affected. In her office, Angela closed the door and let out a long breath, leaning against the desk. Her mind replayed the shove, Rick's words, the way the room fell silent. She knew she had a choice to make. She could let it slide, file it away like so many other slights, or she could take action. But it wasn't that simple. Rick was well liked by some of the higher-ups, even if they turned a blind eye to his temper. He had friends in the department who would defend him. Angela knew that reporting him could mean more scrutiny on her, more whispers about her being too emotional or difficult. But letting it go would send a message she wasn't willing to send. She was still deep in thought when her door opened without a knock. It was Captain Harris, her second in command and one of the few people in the department she trusted. He closed the door behind him and gave her a look that was half concern, half admiration. "I saw what happened," he said, crossing his arms. "You okay?" Angela nodded, though the tension in her shoulders said otherwise. "I'm fine." Harris raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to handle this alone, you know." "I know," she said, her tone softening. "But I also know how this goes. Rick's been here a long time. He's got allies. And you've got me," Harris said firmly. "And more people than you think." She met his eyes, searching for any sign of doubt, but found none. Harris had always been in her corner, even when it wasn't easy. He was one of the few who judged her by her work and not by anything else. He crossed the line. Harris continued. "If you want to take this up the chain, I'll back you." Angela sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's not just about me, Harris. It's about the department. If this turns into a spectacle, it'll hurt the reputation of everyone here." Harris leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Angela, what's worse, making waves or letting him get away with it? You don't deserve this. No one does." She knew he was right. She'd fought too hard to get where she was to let Rick's outburst go unchecked. Still, the weight of the decision pressed down on her. She wasn't just a leader, she was a symbol of change in a place that wasn't always ready for it. Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door, followed by the nervous face of Officer Daniels, one of the younger recruits. "Chief," he said, hesitant, "there's been another incident." "It's Rick." Angela and Harris exchanged a look, and without another word, they followed Daniels down the hallway. The chatter of the station faded as they approached the briefing room, where several officers were gathered, their faces tense. Rick stood in the center, arms crossed, defiant. Angela stepped forward. "What's going on?" One of the officers, visibly shaken, spoke up. "Rick, he was out in the parking lot. He smashed the rearview mirror on your car." Angela's jaw clenched. Rick didn't deny it. He stared at her, daring her to react, his face a mask of contempt. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but clear. Angela stared at him, her mind racing. The room was waiting for her response, but instead of anger, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She could see now that Rick was desperate. He wanted to provoke her, to make her lose control. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Not yet. Angela locked eyes with Rick, her expression unreadable. The room remained silent, the tension thick enough to cut through. Rick's challenge hung in the air, and Angela knew every officer present was waiting to see what she would do. She could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others wary, and a few even hopeful. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, refusing to let his display rattle her. "Go back to your desk," she said evenly. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, and it unsettled everyone, including Rick. Now. For a moment, Rick didn't move, as if daring her to push the issue further. But something in Angela's gaze made him hesitate. The room remained frozen as the two locked in a silent standoff, but Angela didn't flinch, didn't blink. Finally, Rick gave a short, bitter laugh and turned, walking out of the room without another word. The sound of his heavy boots echoed down the hallway as the others exchanged uneasy glances. Angela stood there a moment longer, her face betraying nothing, before she turned to the officers still gathered. "Everyone back to work," she said quietly, and one by one, they drifted away, unsure of what had just happened but knowing they'd witnessed something important. Harris waited until the room was clear before speaking. "He's unraveling," he said, his voice low but firm. "You need to file a report, Angela. This can't keep escalating." Angela nodded slowly, her hands resting on her hips as she stared at the door Rick had just walked through. "I know," she admitted, though the weariness in her tone made it clear how much the decision weighed on her. "But I need to handle this carefully. He's dangerous, and we both know it." Harris gave a short nod, but there was worry in his eyes. "You're right," he said, his voice softening. "But don't wait too long. He's not just pushing boundaries, he's ready to break them." Later that evening, Angela sat alone in her office, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The station was quieter now, most of the officers having clocked out for the night, but she remained, thinking through her next move. Rick's behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was a clear sign of something deeper, something more dangerous. She couldn't afford to underestimate him. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Harris. "I've got your back, no matter what." The simple words brought a small, grateful smile to her face, but they didn't ease the knot of tension in her chest. Just as she was about to reply, there was a knock at the door. Angela frowned. It was late, too late for most people to still be around. She stood, her hand instinctively brushing her hip where her badge rested, and walked to the door, opening it cautiously. To her surprise, it was Officer Daniels again, looking nervous, shifting from foot to foot like a kid about to confess something. "Chief," he said quietly, glancing down the hall before meeting her gaze. "Can I talk to you for a second? It's about Rick." Angela stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "What is it, Daniels?" He entered, shutting the door behind him, his eyes darting around like he expected Rick to burst in at any moment. "I don't know if I should be telling you this," he began, his voice low, "but I think you need to know. Rick's been talking to some of the others. Saying stuff about you." Angela's expression didn't change, but inside, she felt a spark of irritation. "Go on," she said evenly. Daniels hesitated. "He's saying you're not fit to lead. That you got the job because of politics, not because you earned it. He's trying to turn people against you, Chief. He's even talking about taking it to the press, spinning some story about how you're unfit." Angela listened, her jaw tightening. She had expected resistance, but the idea of Rick actively working to undermine her on such a public level was a new low, even for him. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Daniels nodded, looking relieved. "I just thought you should know. A lot of us support you, Chief. We're not all like him." Angela gave him a small smile, appreciating the gesture more than she could say. "I appreciate that, Daniels. Really." After he left, Angela sat back down, the weight of the situation pressing harder on her. Rick wasn't just acting out, he was escalating, and he wasn't going to stop until she was out of the picture. She couldn't ignore it anymore. He wanted a war, and he was going to get one. But she was going to fight it on her terms. The next morning, the atmosphere in the station was tense. Rumors had already started to spread about the previous day's confrontation, and Angela could feel the eyes on her as she walked through the halls. Some were supportive, others skeptical, and a few clearly waiting for her to fall. Rick was at his desk, his eyes following her as she passed, a smug look on his face. But Angela didn't acknowledge him. She went straight to her office, shut the door, and made a decision she should have made days ago. She picked up the phone and dialed Internal Affairs. It was time to make things official. Angela's hand hovered over the phone as it rang, each tone stretching out longer than the last. She knew once the line connected, there would be no turning back. Filing a report with Internal Affairs wasn't just about Rick. It meant exposing the department to scrutiny, pulling back the curtain on the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for months, maybe longer. Finally, a voice answered on the other end. "Internal Affairs, Officer Jacobs speaking." Angela steadied her voice. "This is Chief Monroe. I need to file a formal complaint regarding an officer under my command. It's urgent." There was a pause, and Angela could almost hear the gears turning on the other end. "Understood, Chief. Can you provide the details?" As she outlined the events, the shove, the vandalism, the harassment, she kept her tone even, clinical, but inside, every word felt heavy. Jacobs listened carefully, asking for clarifications, noting every incident. When the call ended, Angela leaned back in her chair, the quiet of her office suddenly oppressive. She stared at the phone for a long moment before a knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Harris again, his face set in a serious expression. He closed the door behind him and sat down across from her without waiting for an invitation. "It's done," she said before he could ask. "I filed the complaint." Harris nodded, his face unreadable. "Good. But you know what this means." "I do," Angela replied. "Rick's not going to take this lying down." Harris let out a slow breath, leaning forward. "He's going to come after you harder now. And if IA gets involved, everyone will be watching. You need to be ready for that." Angela gave him a small, tired smile. "I've been ready for a long time, Harris." He just didn't realize it. But as confident as she sounded, the tension in her shoulders gave her away. Harris noticed, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he stood up, giving her a reassuring nod. "I'll keep an eye on him. You're not alone in this." The rest of the day passed in a strange, heavy haze. Word of the IA investigation spread fast, and Angela could feel the shift in the station's atmosphere. Rick stayed away from her office, but his presence loomed, every glance, every quiet conversation another reminder that he was still watching, still waiting. Later that evening, Angela walked out to the parking lot alone. The sky was dark, clouds hanging low. The air thick with the promise of rain. Her car sat where she'd left it, the broken mirror still dangling by a thread, a silent reminder of Rick's anger. She stopped for a moment, looking at it, feeling the exhaustion settle in. A noise behind her snapped her out of her thoughts. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, echoed across the empty lot. She turned, and there he was, Rick, standing a few feet away, his face shadowed under the dim streetlights. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low and cold. "But this isn't over." Angela stood her ground, her heart pounding but her face calm. "It is over, Rick. You just don't realize it yet." He took a step closer, and for the first time, she saw the cracks in his composure, the twitch in his jaw, the wildness in his eyes. "You think IA's going to save you? They don't care about you. They care about protecting their own. And you're not one of them." Angela didn't move. "You crossed the line," she said quietly. "And now you're afraid. That's why you're here." Rick laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Afraid? Of you?" He shook his head. "You've got it all wrong. You're the one who should be afraid. Because when this blows over, and it will, you'll be out, and I'll still be here." Angela felt a strange calm wash over her. "You're right about one thing," she said. "This isn't over. But you won't be the one left standing." The sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension, and both of them turned to see Harris walking toward them, his expression hard, his hand resting near his belt. He didn't speak, just stood there, watching Rick with a steady, unwavering gaze. Rick's face twisted in frustration, and for a moment, Angela thought he might lash out. But then he stepped back, sneering. "This isn't over," he repeated, backing away into the shadows. Angela exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Harris stayed by her side, watching until Rick was out of sight. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "Yeah, I'm okay." But she knew the real storm was just beginning. The parking lot felt eerily quiet once Rick disappeared into the darkness. Angela stood there for a moment longer, her pulse gradually slowing, though the weight of the confrontation still pressed on her chest. Harris glanced at her, his eyes filled with concern, but she offered a small nod, silently assuring him she was fine, even if it wasn't entirely true. "I'll walk you to your car," he said, his voice soft but firm. Angela didn't argue. She appreciated Harris' steady presence, especially now. They walked side by side in silence until she reached her car. The broken mirror swung slightly in the evening breeze, another reminder of how close things had come to spiraling further. Harris stopped, his hand resting on the roof of the car. "He's unraveling," Harris said, echoing his words from earlier. "But that was different. He's losing control." Angela nodded, unlocking her car door. "I know. And he's not going to stop until someone makes him." Harris opened his mouth to respond, but the faint sound of tires screeching in the distance made them both pause. Angela's eyes narrowed, scanning the dark lot, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. She shook her head, brushing it off as nothing more than coincidence. "Get home safe," Harris said, giving her a final nod before turning to head back toward the station. Angela slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind her. She sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, forcing herself to breathe deeply. The encounter with Rick had left her more shaken than she wanted to admit. She glanced at the rearview mirror, catching sight of her own reflection. There was a weariness in her eyes, a heaviness that came with carrying the weight of the badge and everything it meant. As she drove away, the quiet hum of the engine filled the space, a small comfort in the stillness of the night. But a few blocks from the station, that same unsettling noise returned. Screeching tires, closer this time. Angela's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and her stomach tightened. A dark SUV was following her, its headlights off, the outline of the vehicle barely visible in the shadows. She tightened her grip on the wheel, her mind racing. Could it be Rick, or was this something else entirely? She couldn't be sure, but every instinct told her not to stop. She pressed the gas, her heart pounding as the SUV mirrored her movements, picking up speed. Angela forced herself to stay calm, her mind working quickly. She wasn't far from a main road, where there would be more traffic, more witnesses. If she could get there, she'd be safe, or at least safer. She made a sharp turn onto a side street, hoping to shake the SUV, but it stayed close, relentless. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and she grabbed it, keeping one hand on the wheel. It was Harris, calling, likely to check if she'd made it home. She answered on speaker, her voice tense but controlled. "Harris, I need you to listen. I'm being followed," she said quickly. Dark SUV, no plates. There was a brief pause, and then Harris' voice sharpened. "Where are you?" "Just past Elm," she said, making another quick turn. "Heading toward the main road." "I'm on my way," Harris said, the sound of him moving fast on the other end. "Keep driving. Don't stop." Angela's eyes darted between the road and the mirror, watching as the SUV gained on her. The tires screeched again as it got closer, the headlights suddenly flashing on, blinding her momentarily. Her heart raced as she swerved, narrowly avoiding the curb. "Angela, stay with me," Harris said, his voice steady, keeping her grounded. "You're almost there." She could see the main road ahead, the glow of streetlights offering a glimmer of hope. But just as she thought she might make it, the SUV lurched forward, clipping the back of her car with a sickening crunch. Her vehicle fishtail-ed, and she fought to regain control, her breath catching in her throat. "Harris," she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. "I'm close," he said, urgency laced in his tone. "Just hold on." Angela's car skidded to a stop on the shoulder, her chest heaving as she watched the SUV slow, then peel away into the darkness, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. She sat there, frozen, the silence deafening, her hands trembling on the wheel. Moments later, Harris' patrol car pulled up beside her, lights flashing. He jumped out, rushing to her side, his face pale with worry. "Are you okay?" he asked, pulling open her door. Angela nodded shakily, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "They're gone," she whispered. Harris' jaw clenched as he looked down the empty road, frustration and fear etched into his features. "This wasn't random," he said. "Someone wanted to scare you." Angela leaned back in her seat, the realization sinking in. This wasn't just Rick anymore. Something bigger was at play. And whoever it was, they weren't done. Angela sat in the passenger seat of Harris' patrol car, the smell of burnt rubber still lingering in the air. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by the fear that had gripped her just moments before. Harris was on the phone with dispatch, his voice low but tense, detailing what had happened. She stared out the window, her mind racing. The dark SUV was more than just a threat. It was a message. When Harris hung up, he looked at her, his face a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to get back to the station," he said. "This isn't over." Angela nodded, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. As they drove, she replayed everything in her head, the vandalism, the confrontation with Rick, and now this. It felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite fit together. She trusted Harris, but there was a nagging feeling that she was missing something crucial, something that could change everything. Back at the station, the mood was tense. Officers cast glances in Angela's direction, some sympathetic, others wary. News of the IA investigation had already spread, and the incident with the SUV would only add fuel to the fire. Angela knew this wasn't just about Rick anymore. Someone else was involved, someone who wanted to silence her. Harris followed her into her office, shutting the door behind them. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "I've been looking into Rick's records. He's had complaints before, but they always disappeared. Someone's been covering for him." Angela frowned. "Who?" "That's the thing," Harris said, leaning forward. "It's not just one person. It's a group. They've been protecting each other for years. This goes way deeper than Rick." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Angela felt a chill run down her spine. "How deep?" Harris hesitated, his face grim. "All the way to the top." Angela stared at him, the pieces finally clicking into place. Rick wasn't acting alone. He was part of something bigger, something that had been operating under the radar for years. And now, they saw her as a threat. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the desk. She picked it up, her stomach tightening when she saw the unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Chief Monroe," she said, her voice steady. There was silence on the other end for a moment, then a familiar voice spoke. "You should have backed off when you had the chance." Angela's blood ran cold. It wasn't Rick. It was someone else, someone she hadn't expected. "Captain Ellis," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The line went dead. Angela set the phone down slowly, her hands trembling. Harris' eyes widened. "Ellis?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. She nodded, her mind racing. "He's been behind it all. He's the one pulling the strings." They didn't have time to process it. A loud crash echoed from the front of the station, followed by shouting. Harris drew his weapon, motioning for Angela to stay back, but she wasn't about to hide. She grabbed her own sidearm, following him into the hallway. The sight that greeted them was chaos. Rick stood in the center of the room, flanked by two other officers. His eyes locked on Angela, a twisted smile on his face. "You thought you could bring me down?" he sneered. "You were wrong." But Angela wasn't afraid anymore. She raised her weapon, her voice steady and clear. "It's over, Rick. We know everything." Rick's smile faltered, but before he could respond, the doors burst open, and EA agents flooded the room. Harris had called for backup, and they arrived just in time. Rick's accomplices dropped their weapons, and Rick himself was forced to the ground, handcuffed and seething. Angela watched as he was led away, the weight of the moment settling over her. But the real shock came when Captain Ellis walked in, his hands already raised, a smug expression on his face. "You won this round, Chief," he said, his voice calm. "But you'll never clean up this department. There will always be more like me." Angela met his gaze, unflinching. "Then I'll keep fighting." As Ellis was taken away, Angela felt a strange sense of peace. She had won, but she knew it was just the beginning. The fight for justice never truly ended. The station felt eerily quiet after the chaos died down, though the tension still hung in the air like smoke. Angela sat at her desk, staring at the mess of paperwork scattered across it. The adrenaline that had kept her going was finally fading, leaving exhaustion in its place. She rubbed her temples, trying to process everything that had happened. Rick was in custody, along with the others who had followed him blindly. Captain Ellis, the real puppet master, had been exposed. But even with them gone, the weight of what had been uncovered lingered. Harris knocked lightly on her door before stepping in. He looked tired too, but there was a sense of relief in his expression. "Ia took Rick and Ellis downtown," he said, sinking into the chair across from her. "They're not getting out of this one." Angela gave a small nod, though the victory felt more like a battle won than the end of the war. "There will be fallout," she said quietly. "People will question everything. Trust in the department will take a hit. And we'll rebuild it," Harris said firmly. "Brick by brick if we have to. People need to know they can trust us, and that starts with cleaning house." Angela appreciated his optimism, but she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The corruption went deep, and it wouldn't vanish overnight. Still, the first step had been taken. They had exposed the rot, and now it was up to them, and the remaining good officers, to ensure it didn't fester again. "You did the right thing," Harris added, watching her closely. "You stood your ground." Angela looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. "You were there every step of the way." He shrugged, a little sheepish. "It's what partners do." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the hum of the station filling the room. It was a quiet reminder that life would go on, that the work would continue. But the weight on Angela's shoulders felt a little lighter now. They had fought back, and they had won. The door to her office opened again, and a younger officer poked his head in, looking nervous. "Chief Monroe, the press is outside," he said. "They're asking for a statement." Angela sighed, standing and smoothing her jacket. "I suppose it was only a matter of time." Harris stood too, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "You've got this." She walked through the station, feeling the eyes of the remaining officers on her. Some looked ashamed, others relieved, but all of them seemed to understand that the department had changed tonight. She stepped outside into the cool night air, the bright lights of cameras and microphones greeting her. Reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic chorus, but Angela raised a hand to calm them. "Tonight, we took an important step," she began, her voice clear and steady. "A step toward accountability, integrity, and justice. There are those who sought to undermine the values we swore to uphold, but they have been exposed, and they will face the consequences." The crowd quieted, listening intently as she continued. "This department belongs to the community it serves, and I am committed to restoring the trust that has been broken. We will do better. I will do better. And together, we will rebuild what has been lost." With that, she turned and walked back inside, not waiting for their follow-up questions. She didn't need their approval. The work ahead would speak for itself. As the night wore on, Angela finally found herself alone in her office, the quiet settling over her like a blanket. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, allowing herself a rare moment of peace. She thought about Rick, about Ellis, and all the others who had betrayed their oaths. They were gone now, but the scars they left would take time to heal. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Harris. "You did good, Chief. Get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day." Asterisk. She smiled, setting the phone down. Tomorrow would indeed be a new day. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But for now, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had fought back and won. As the lights dimmed in the station and the city settled into sleep, Angela closed her eyes, knowing the fight for justice would never truly end, but that didn't mean she would ever stop fighting.